Today I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite books, which I've recently rediscovered and which I think has a great deal of relevance to science fiction and fantasy with political themes. And the book is called simply Z by Vassilis Vassilikos. I hope I'm not mangling his name horribly. The book was originally written in 1965, I believe, and became something of a sensation in its native Greece because it was an attempt at fictionalizing something that happened in that country and that created a political scandal. It was about the assassination of a man named Grigory Lambrakis. It was basically the equivalent of a member of parliament in the UK or a congressman in the United States. And he was assassinated more or less in broad daylight by people who were displeased, shall we say, with his leftist politics. And this was at a time when there was a very strong anti-communist sentiment in the country, and anything that reeked of leftism, including things like protesting the presence of nuclear weapons, was considered communist. And so he was murdered rather noisily, again in broad daylight, by his opponents. And then there was an inquest, there was an attempt to find the truth, and then the attempt to find the truth was itself smothered by further upheaval. The people who were found guilty were mostly at the lower levels. People at the higher up were pardoned, and then there was a military upheaval in the country that more or less negated everything. So it's a heartbreaking story, and it's told in wonderfully propulsive, beautifully written language. It's also just a beautiful novel. It's a great read. It's a great thriller. It's a great work of literature. And the way that it unfolds, the fatal night of the events, and then the aftermath, the investigation, the process of finding the truth, it had a great deal of influence on other works like Oliver Stone's JFK. And it was itself made into a film in 1969 by director Costa Gavras, and the film was itself also a giant hit. And I remember coming across it myself when I was quite young, and it had a tremendous impact on me. Now, before I get into the details of how the story relates to the writing of science fiction and fantasy, I wanted to give some notes on the concept of art as politics, on the concept that art is political. You've probably heard a statement to this effect in one form or another: all art is political. And I think a more precise way to put it would be all art is a reflection of the politics and the worldview of its creators. And sometimes that is conscious and sometimes that is not. And since most of these videos are addressed to creators, if you yourself are a creator, you might as well sit down and investigate what your beliefs are and lay them out as systematically as you can. So not so that you put them into your story heavy-handedly, but so that you don't end up intending one thing with your story and writing another. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there is never any question, at least for me, in Z about what the author feels about his subject. He is not himself a communist, but he is also not heartless. His heart goes out to those in the story who want better things, like Z himself, the man who was assassinated, and everyone who wants better things and gets beaten into submission simply for asking for it. That's who the author's heart goes out to. And that brings me to the subject of the political implications of science fiction and fantasy. To my mind, there is no inherent bias for SF or fantasy in terms of its political alignments. Those stories can serve progressive or centrist or reactionary worldviews. It's entirely up to the story. But again, it helps to know what the worldviews are and what they amount to ahead of time, especially if your goal is to make politics a key element in the story. One example that I can think of is if you believe that utopia is not possible, but that a less imperfect society is possible, that is going to shape the way you think about politics in your story, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, very differently than if you believe that we can have all that we want in our world at one blow, as long as we set aside our scruples to do this. So I think that Z, for instance, would have been written very differently if its author had been much more avowedly aligned with one of these factions rather than the other. And he's not, but at the same time, we're never in doubt about where the author's sympathies, where his heart lies with his characters. So good politically informed stories are unambiguous in their intentions. We may not agree with the politics, but the implications are always clear to us. So if we read a well-written political fiction, we're reading stories where the writer does not need to obscure what his political view is. then we can see better how that's possible. And that's why I bring Z up as an example. The author does not have to play coy with what he believes. He doesn't say one thing when he means another, even when he's being artful, even when he's using techniques like irony or artistic license. So if there's a difference between, I think, progressive and reactionary politics when they're in fiction, including science fiction and fantasy, to my mind, the big difference is that it's far easier to be reactionary without trying, to be reactionary without realizing it, without thinking about it, than it is to be progressive. It is also far harder to be nuanced and enlightened about whatever particular view you are trying to put onto the page than it is to be didactic about it. It's always easier to write a lecture instead of setting an example. And so that for me is one of the big lessons that Z has for its readers, or its viewers if you watch the movie. It's not just that it is aware of these things, but it has this additional level of nuance. And the biggest way that this comes through, again, is through how all the justice that is done in the story is provisional. It only comes in a way that ultimately has a half-life, so to speak. And that's not a comforting lesson. It's not comforting to know that all of that work can evaporate because the country's power structure has been destroyed by a military insurrection. But at the same time, I do feel that those lessons are empowering, precisely because they're not comforting. The lesson of the book for me is not that the arc of history automatically bends towards justice, which is always a very comforting thing to believe. It is not that progress is assured. It is not that the truth will always out. It is that these things only happen, that the arc only bends towards justice, etc., because people make it so, and because they never let up. And that arc can be unbent just as easily, that as soon as you let go, it springs back. And that's a tougher lesson to swallow, but it's also a more honest one. And even, especially if you're creating stories that classify as escapist or fantastic, it helps to use hard truths like those as a starting point because they give you more from the real world to build on. It always helps to have real world things to draw on for context and inspiration. And that's another reason I like Z a lot, because it was being written more or less in real time while the events were unfolding in Greece. And it draws on them very directly with very little in the way of alteration. So you don't need to be that stenographic. You don't need to be writing down history in real time as it happens. But it does help to see what in the real world you can use as your guide. There's a lot of history out there, both recent and not so recent. And I chose Z as an example of this in big part because I don't think a lot of people know a tremendous amount about the recent history of Greece. And that makes it fresh territory to investigate without it being too off the map. And one more thing I want to say about this is my encounter with the book was a deeply transformative experience for me. I actually encountered the movie first because it was shown on, I think, a local PBS outlet when I was in junior high school, when I was, I think, in 8th grade or something like that. And I remember being absolutely galvanized while I was watching it. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. I thought it was just fascinating from beginning to end. And I think my parents were a little surprised by this because I was very much still a Star Wars and Star Trek kind of kid. And then later I bumped into a paperback copy of it at the library. It was in the Carol where they have the take a book, leave a book kind of thing. And I smashed through the book in about a week, which for me was, for a book of that type, that was a really rapid read. So I never forgot about it. And then it fell out of print and became that much more, it wasn't discussed, it wasn't talked about as much anymore. And I thought that was kind of a shame. It was reprinted recently in its 50th anniversary by Seven Stories Press. It's available both digitally and, as you can see, in a conventional paper edition. And all of the reasons why I wanted to recommend it start with the fact that it is a fantastically good political story and a fantastically good story, period. But on top of that, there are things that I think can be of great importance to anybody who wants to write science fiction or fantasy that has a political element to it. This is a great place to get a sense of how those things can be really rich and really artful. So I hope you check it out. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, and I hope you're able to get as much out of it as I did too. See you around.